In today's complex environment, almost every major project, from mining to transmission lines, is contentious. Hi, my name is Allie Meeres.
And I'm Byng Giraud.
Welcome to Primary Risk, where each month we speak with the people behind the projects shaping our world.
We'll be hosting candid conversations and hearing from industry leaders, political figures, engineers, and project proponents. We'll be exploring the soft issue risks, challenges, and solutions, and behind-the-scenes stories of what it took to get these complex projects across the finish line. Or not.
So thank you so much for coming today, Susannah. We really appreciate it. You've spent the last 20 years of your career at the intersection of environmental, social, and governance interests in Canada and abroad. In your current role, you're president and country chair of Shell Canada. You're also the VP of Emerging Energy Solutions in Canada, which we'll talk a bit more about in this podcast. And really what we're focused on today is before your work at Shell, you were the director of corporate affairs at LNG Canada, a joint venture of many of the largest companies in the world, Shell, Petronas, Mitsubishi, PetroChina, and KOGAS, where you were responsible for all aspects of primary risk and soft issue risk, from the federal and provincial regulatory approvals to Indigenous relations and negotiations, government relations, media relations, community consultation, and communications. And what is really impressive is that when the joint venture participants took a final investment decision, and having worked at Woodfibre, we know how hard it is to get to that. In 2018, it was heralded as the single largest private sector investment in Canadian history, and I believe it still is. So thank you for being with us here today, and welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Thank you so much.
Susannah, it's good to see you again. It's a real pleasure. I consider you a friend, and we've been in the trenches together. So I want to maybe pull this back a bit right away to know a little more about you. What are you doing? So that's history. We're going to get into the LNG project. What are you doing now? Like what's consuming you these days?
What's consuming me? Well, on the professional end, of course, it's the overall Shell enterprise in Canada. And it's an integrated oil and gas company. So as you would expect, we do everything from your retail stations where you might fill up your car, where you might charge your EV, all the way through to jet fuel, all the way through to upstream, which is where we look for oil and gas, produce it, to refining chemicals, and now also looking at other decarbonization opportunities such as hydrogen, carbon capture sequestration, and of course things like integrated gas, LNG Canada being one example of that. So looking at the entire Canadian portfolio, what it is today, but then also how do we continue to attract investment from Shell Group? So I'm responsible for the Canadian aspect, but really I have one shareholder, which is Shell Group, which is based in London. So I, along with my other peers in Canada, the business leads, compete for capital. And our job is to demonstrate that we can take that capital from Shell, invest it wise, and make returns for the Shell Group while doing it in a way that's sustainable and has a lot of support from the communities, Indigenous groups as well.
But you're doing lots of other things that don't have the word Shell attached to them.
Oh, I do. Okay. Well, we want to talk about that. I am a very, very proud mother of two kids, Robert and Gabriella. Robert is 18 now.
Ooh, graduation?
He graduated last year, had his first year in university. And then my daughter is 16. She's got one more year left. And so that is my true joy. And that is, I hope to say, the most fantastic thing I've done in my life is have those two kids.
Awesome. Well, and you live in Vancouver.
I do.
And where else have you lived in Canada?
So I grew up in Calgary. I was born in Regina, Saskatchewan, but moved as a very young kid to Calgary. And it was interesting because everybody when I was growing up in Calgary was in the energy industry for the most part. And so when I was about 16, 17, I said, I don't want anything to do with this. I'm getting the heck out of Calgary, getting the heck out of Alberta. And I did, with the hope that I would actually become an international correspondent. I wanted to travel the world. Cool. I wanted to go to different zones, developing country, war zones even, and report on that. And so I went to school. I had an undergraduate degree in journalism. But then I decided I needed to understand a little bit more about commerce and finance and economics. So I went to graduate school at Johns Hopkins, and I got a degree there in energy, environment, science, and tech, with economics as part of the degree as well. But that then parlayed it into one other thing after another. And anyway, circuitously, I found myself back in the energy sector, but it was not my original intention.
But was that back to Calgary? Or
You know, it was, strangely enough, it started when I was in graduate school. I did a sabbatical down in Santiago, Chile. I did that in part because I had an opportunity to work for a company called Chilhan Air. And this was back in the mid-90s. And Chilhan Air was building the first gas combined cycle power plant that would take the first gas from the Gas Andes pipeline, which would have been built across the Andes Mountains to bring gas from the Mendoza province in Argentina. And as long story short, I got an opportunity to go work down there for 6 months where I learned Spanish. But then I also...
some great wine, I bet.
Of course, por supuesto. But then what was so interesting about that, here I was trying to get away from the energy sector. This sabbatical or time that I had down there, I ended up working for this company that was responsible for trying to decarbonize, desmog Chile, Santiago, because it was full of coal-fired power plants. But they were basically going to build the first combined cycle gas power plant. But in order to do that, the power plant itself, they had to build a pipeline. And the pipeline happened to go through some indigenous communities. And it was the first kind of stakeholder engagement that I ever did, was to go into those communities and start to have conversations about pipelines. And lo and behold, I find myself kind of doing some of that today, or having done some of that today, but it started back in my college years.
Is that what gets you out of bed in the morning? I mean, because if that was your first experience down there, I mean, is that what still kind of lights you up in the work that you do today?
I think what lights me up is definitely engaging with people. I mean, I think that's an aspect of my job, whether or not it's with people that weren't talking about energy issues, communities where they're talking about, I'm having issues or what are the challenges. I'd like to sit down and have conversations with people. And I think that opportunity really exposed me for the first time about relationship building. Because here you had, and it was fascinating actually, the family was called La Familia Astorga. And they were a family that had beautiful acreage where the pipeline was supposed to run through. And they didn't want it there. But the executives of the Gas Andes pipeline wanted to have a chief-to-chief, you could call it, conversation, a senior executive to the senior family member. And I can remember we would come into their dining room and we'd sit around this table and we would just talk. And I was more of an observer. I was not, in any kind of senior leadership position, but we walked in the gardens, we walked around their property, we had the conversations, sat down at their table, met eye to eye, started to understand what was in their interest, what was in our interest, how we could begin to build trust. And eventually the pipeline did go through there, and eventually things turned out just fine. But I didn't realize then that what I was observing at that point in my life would be something that became so important when we talked about projects like LNG Canada, which is really sitting to start with a conversation, sitting to start to build a relationship, knowing that if you do that well, anything that follows, you can still have those hard conversations and disagreements, but you've started from a foundation of trust. It's almost like a marriage where if your values are in the same place and your end destination is the same. You can work out the pieces in between. Mm-hmm. And the end destination, of course, in any kind of relationship like we experience in energy projects, has to be one where there's shared benefits. It can't just be the corporation winning, right? And the community's not. It has to be where you have shared mutual interests. And that's where, again, the pathway to get to that point can be rocky at times. But if you still have those shared mutual interests, you'll get through it. And if you still are based on a foundation of trust.
So you learned those lessons right at the beginning of your career.
I must have observed them, took them in, understood the value of that. And I think maybe it stuck with me. It definitely stuck with me.
Well, that's very an interesting story, because I guess, when we talk about primary risks and the dealing with subjective risk or people, the soft issue risk, we often find people who come from the natural resource sector and development sectors. That's a lesson that it takes them a long time to learn. It comes much later. So that's fascinating. That was sort of your first real encounter.
It was. And then I would say, I subsequent to that, when I finished my graduate degree, I ended up at the time wanting to go work for the World Bank or the UN. They weren't hiring at the time, or they weren't hiring me. But people that were hiring were like .coms and companies like that. So I actually ended up working for Anderson Consulting and doing some computer programming, which then went into enterprise resource management, which then went into business intelligence software. So I actually spent some time in the tech center, more on the business analyst side, which is matching business needs to software and then customizing it.
Were you still overseas at the time?
I was down in the States. So I finished my school at Johns Hopkins and then got hired by Accenture, Anderson Consulting, which then became Accenture, but then was with them for a few years before I was, brought into a company called MicroStrategy. All that is to say is that I began to understand the importance of how do we use technology to advance business, and then how do we make, business advance technology and the relationship there. But then you might be asking, well, how did you go from being there in energy, then going to technology, but now being where you are? And I've shared this in the past. It was 9/11 that brought me back to Canada. And the reason was I had advanced in my career. MicroStrategy had gone from a business analyst into sales. And I was living in New York City. And I was living in Lower Manhattan. And, I had a number of customers who were, down in the towers or the Trade Center. And I can remember living downtown on that morning. And I was actually getting ready for a meeting to go downtown to the World Trade Center. And I can remember my building shook. And I used to live in this plumbing warehouse in the Lower East Side. And I thought that the guys downstairs had dropped a heavy box of equipment. But then when I walked by my TV and I had Squawk Box on, I could see that there was a hole in one of the towers. I thought, oh my God. And like many of us at the time, we thought it was like a Cessna. But I actually had a balcony that I shared with two of my neighbors. And we went up there and you could actually see that it was a hole in one of the towers because we could see the towers from where we were. Went back downstairs. The other plane went to the second tower, came back up. And then you could begin to see from where we were that you begin to see like white stuff coming from the bottom. And that's when the tower started to come down. I went into the flat. And yeah, the rest was like a week where I don't even remember what happened. But it was a week where when stuff happens like that, like many of us go through life moments, you ask yourself, am I doing the right thing? Am I with the right people? Am I doing things that matter to me? And I didn't answer yes to any of that. You know, I was in technology. I had lost my drive for the company that I was working for. I had not felt engaged. I was not in a good relationship. And so I ended up saying, you know what, it's time for a break. And so I ended up leaving the company I was with. I ended up leaving the person I was with. I went to Mexico for a couple of months. The one mucho tequila, mucho cerveza. But I was down there. And then I came back to Calgary because when I grew up in Calgary, I had interned at a company called Foothills Pipelines. A little bit of pipeline history again. Foothills was the pre-build for the original Alaska natural gas transportation system. That pre-build was to basically bring gas from Alberta across to the lower 48, so from Canada to lower 48. And that pre-build was built. Of course, the upper part never did get built, but that pipeline then became a very important way of getting Canadian gas to the United States. So I worked for them as an intern. They were then acquired by TransCanada. I came knocking on TransCanada's door, asking for a job. They gave me a shot doing project development in Quebec, of all things, but then eventually moved it to the United States. Eventually asked if I could help in Washington, D.C., because that's where I went to school. And the funny thing about going to school in a place like Washington, D.C. is a lot of the people you go to school with either end up working on the Hill, find themselves in the White House. And the good thing is if you have stories on them, or if you remember the frat house when they didn't really want to be known. Anyway, there's lots of stuff.
If Byng went to school in D.C., you'd have a lot of stories on him.
I do have a lot of stories. And, you know, House of Cards was something I never really watched because it was a little bit too real. Made me feel a little crazy. But that was relationships, really. You know, it was relationships that you carried over time. And then those relationships allowed for me to advance new relationships. And so I ended up joining TransCanada originally as a contractor that then hired me full-time and then managed Washington, D.C. for them and the U.S. Northeast, where they had some investments in pipelines, power plants. And so I did that for a number of years until eventually TransCanada had another joint venture with Shell called Broadwater LNG. I could go on, but that was really, I would say, also where I cut my teeth in stakeholder engagement.
So I'm not familiar with Broadwater.
Yeah, so this was back in the day when we felt like we didn't have gas to develop. Of course,
it was going to be import facilities.
Exactly. So
when was this? Give us the date.
This was like 2004.
Okay, so yeah, LNG didn't exist.
Yeah, LNG imports did, right? Not exports. And so this was pre-shale gas. And this great idea was to bring natural gas in liquid form into the middle of Long Island Sound, in between Connecticut and Long Island, and you basically would float this floating storage regas unit, barge, over a pipeline, and then you'd tap the pipeline and you'd feed this gas, you'd regasify it, feed this gas into the pipeline, which would feed New York City. Now, why would you do that there? Well, because this is great, huge, Long Island Sound, but New York used to pay the highest prices for gas because it was at the end of the pipeline. And we felt like if you could bring this terminal in, bring the ships in from wherever you could bring in the gas, you could bring it straight into the back end of the pipeline and you could lower gas prices. Well, technically brilliant. Non-technically, you're in one of the richest parts of the United States. You have Connecticut, you have Long Island. You've got a fairly powerful group of, legislators, both at the state and the federal level and the city level. And so, yeah, you were dealing with Chuck Schumer's, the Hillary Clintons. You had Bloomberg, who was mayor at the time. You had a series of governors who we went through, of course, Pataki, Spitzer, and Patterson. And so that was, that for me was I was responsible for the TC Energy side of the stakeholder engagement. So community meetings, government relations, media relations, communications, one of the front people on this project. That's also where I really cut my teeth in trying to understand how do you engage stakeholders? How do you build the relationships? How do you really advance projects in light of, again, strong technical details? Yeah, that makes a lot of technical sense. But from a social acceptance perspective, it really was a tough slog. But, it was a great learning experience.
And how did that project turn out? I mean, I'm guessing it didn't go ahead. But what was the turning point for that project where they said, "Oof, we're gonna"?
Well, interestingly, there was two big turning points. So we were in the permitting process, and this was a Federal Energy Regulatory Commission FERC process. There's also a state process, and the state process, which was a coastal zone permit, we did not get a shift of governors to a governor after Spitzer met his demise, you might recall. But Governor Patterson turned us down, and that then gets appealed to the Department of Commerce. And during that process, and this is sort of like 2008, if I remember correctly, I also started to hear a little bit about this thing called Marcellus Shale. Oh, what's that all about? Oh, it's about this hydraulic fracturing technology. Oh, what's all that about? So at the same time we're thinking about, should we be importing natural gas? We're then beginning to realize right here is a huge resource basin. So should we really be importing gas when you've got it right here? So all of that changed the game. And so
it was a fairly dramatic change.
Very dramatic change. Very dramatic, but it's one of those, that's another lesson for me is that when I think about where we are today in the energy transition, I do believe technology, of course, is the game changer, always has been. But that was an aha moment for me where we were so close to making a serious investment in this, where this technology, this Marcellus Shale was known about for a while. It wasn't like it was like, oh, it just appeared. But we have to stay constant with how we're planning out these scenarios, because in a way, getting turned down that state permit was a blessing. Because that import terminal probably wouldn't have made any sense, given the fact we have all this gas domestic in the United States as a result of shale. So, yeah, that was another learning moment for me, too, when we really think about advancing projects. Let's really understand the global environment. Let's really understand technology and the role that it can play. And let's be very clear that when we do take these final investment decisions, because they're big decisions, that you're looking under every corner to make sure that these can be sustained over time.
So obviously you applied a lot of that learning when you came up to Canada. Was it after that project that you made your way back to us?
I made my way back to Canada after that project. I joined Shell, actually. Left TransCanada, joined Shell. And Shell brought me back to Canada, but then they brought me overseas where I did an upstream international job. And this was really interesting to me, too, because remember I wanted to become a foreign correspondent? Well, this job basically brought me to all those countries that I was like, I wanted to be a writer in. And so I was responsible for Africa, I was responsible for the Middle East, I was responsible for Asia, so China, Japan, Korea, and then I was responsible for Europe, and so, and Russia. And so all of these countries were part of the upstream international communications role that I had, which is really more about the public engagement. So it was all about the strategies around that. Huge portfolio, huge.
How many projects would you have under that global portfolio?
Many. So many projects, and it was projects, but it was existing assets, it was new country entry. One of the most fascinating places that I went to was Iraq. And so, of course, this was right after the war, and Shell had the contract to basically start pumping the oil again. A lot of gas that was being flared. We ended up entering into a new arrangement where we would capture the gas. Bastard gas was created, so we would stop the flaring, and we could actually generate the power. So many great, amazing projects that we worked on. And so I did that job, and that brought me to The Hague, where I was there for a couple of years. I had 2 kids at the time, so that was also being a sort of a single mom with 2 kids because my relationship hadn't lasted, but so much more we can go into, but we won't have the time.
I feel like you need to have a sip of wine.
But, again, like that was a great experience, but that sort of filled my bucket in terms of this international, going into different cultures, how you work in these very different places from a language, culture, ethnicity, development, and then how do you approach that, which is very unique to each of those jurisdictions or places. I would say that experience, too, helped me when I came back to Canada. Because as we know in British Columbia, each nation is not the same.
Yeah.
And so you have to engage as if they're unique. And that's a very similar...
It's unfortunate of it, but I mean, that you would have learned that right away, is that this assumption, it's another Western English-speaking country, it's all the same. That there is quite a bit of diversity, quite a bit of cultural change. But so let me take you to the decision to come to LNG Canada.
Yeah.
So Shell, if you recall, didn't actually have a great reputation in that part of the world.
I know.
People, the LNG Canada is held up as this great success, and it was. But before that, people forget that the coal bed methane leases, there was actually like parades down the city of Terrace and Smithers that get the Shell out. Mm-hmm. Why did you decide to come to a part of the world that maybe Shell wasn't so welcome? What made you make that decision?
Well, so this is a great question. Are you asking me personally, or why did Shell decide to still be?
Well, it's more what you...
Me personally? So that decision, I remember being kind of at the periphery of it and supported it, on the basis of the degree of support and opposition that was there. And it just, ultimately, I don't know that the project made sense at the time too, given alternatives. So I thought it was the right decision. When it came to actually coming to BC and beginning to work on LNG Canada, I guess part of it was I didn't have the memory and I didn't have the baggage and I didn't have maybe even some of the learnings about what had gone right or wrong. I think I came just with an approach of, let's sit down and understand if we can make this work, and not being held back by the way things had been done. And maybe in some ways also I would say this, I give myself a little bit of credit. I did learn from projects that had happened in the past. We had Northern Gateway. We did have the experience with Coal Bed.
There were other projects, yeah.
And, so I did take some of that in. We collectively, I should say Shell did take some of that in. But I think, between myself, Andy Cowlitz, and even people that when we moved to BC, because, Andy is from, South Africa originally, had lived in the Netherlands, lived all over the world. I grew up in Calgary. I had been away for so many years. When I moved to BC in 2013, and by the way, and I say this, and I said this at the time, and I still believe it, if you're going to build a project in BC, live in BC. You do need to understand that BC is not Alberta. I grew up in Alberta, and I know that Alberta is not BC. And
we say it all the time, if this is not Alberta West.
Yeah, it's not.
You can't run this stuff under remote control.
We have wonderful Alberta clients. And
absolutely.
That's
is wise. They have you as a...
Well, I will say, I think that lesson is being learned in real time. And I feel like there's a lot more establishment of local offices, and there's a lot more filling and understanding of getting more folks into roles in community and understanding that relationship that maybe wasn't there 5 or 10 years ago.
I think that's learning. Those are learnings. And again, I'm not trying. Again, I grew up in Calgary, and I have nothing against Calgary or Alberta for that matter at all. But we just know that every community and culture is different, and so you just have to be there to understand it. And so when I was asked to take on this role, I'll also share I had another pivot moment because I moved back to Calgary from The Hague. I had bought a house. And then we had this sort of, 10,000-year storm that basically swept away half the house that I had just bought, condemned the kids' school.
Oh, you were?
Oh, yeah.
That sort of high river flood.
I was. And so it was sort of another sign. Susannah, maybe it's time to look at another place to live. And so I can remember standing in front of my house covered in mud, looking down the kids' school that was condemned. I got a call saying, Susannah, we have a project in BC. Would you take a look at it? Like, no house, no school. My kid's father lives in BC. Let's go do that. So, but I did do it. But as far as kind of moving to BC, part of it was also the fact that I really felt like if I was going to be responsible for engaging the communities, I needed to be at least, in British Columbia, in the community where you're going to be spending a lot of time with people, talking about the project, what's in their interests. And so I'd go to Kitimat quite a bit. I did live in Vancouver. We had people based in Kitimat, of course, BCers. But then also, just like your clients in Calgary are doing, we really need to leverage the insights of people who've been here for a very long time. So we did work with a number of great people who helped me understand the importance of these engagements, but then also, some of the importance of how we engage with Indigenous communities, especially in BC, where they're not under treaty. And so it was a good lesson for me, but it was also kind of consistent with how I guess I felt we always should be doing, is sitting down at the table, understanding, can we actually find ways?
Full circle almost.
Yeah, it is. And not really planned, just sort of ended up that way.
Well, pretty impressive to end up that way. And I mean, speaking of LNG Canada, we did have a couple of questions on that. I'd love to talk a bit about the project. I mean, it was the largest and first LNG project to get across the line in Canada. The podcast is called Primary Risk. So maybe you could give us 1, 2, 3 primary risks that you had to navigate to get to FID, and maybe a little bit of insight as to some of the ones that maybe you didn't think of when you had started the project or were even halfway in, but kind of popped up unexpectedly.
Well, I guess when you think about primary risk, the first thing that, if you look at it sort of holistically, is your site selection. And I say that could be a risk, only in that there's many different variables that you would consider when you look at an LNG site. For us, choosing the site in Kitimat was on the basis that it was an industrial port. They were used to these sorts of activities. It was, the jurisdiction, traditional territory of the Haisla First Nation. There were not competing land claims associated with that. There was infrastructure. So you had the ability to have highways, you had transmission lines, you had navigable waters. So those are some of the criteria. So site selection in terms of a risk was a risk and opportunity for us. You had neighbors that you could work with as well in a community that was open to it. So that'd be one.
I'm going to just interrupt that. So when you look at many of them, because there was 20 that came forward, look at many of them, that's where they faltered right there.
Yeah.
Like there was some, without naming names, there were some sites that were just really off limits. And the fact that companies didn't take the time to learn the local community that this is a no-go zone. Like, that's curious.
Right up front. And, and it's something where, again, and maybe this didn't come up earlier, but when we look at hydrocarbon maturation, using that expression, at Shell, we also learned that what delays us is not our ability to find the resource and produce it. It's actually getting it to market as a result of stakeholder concerns. So we can move very quickly, but it's just a question of, do you have the support? Do you have the regulatory support? Do you have the community support? So we found that our cycles were slowing down because of that piece. And so that's why putting that up front, so you can understand that better, is there support in the community or First Nations? Are these other considerations present? Doing that right up front will save you on the back end.
So you're talking about the soft issue risks.
That's right.
Those were considered as part of the site acquisition for LNG 100%, which I feel like with experiences of other projects up and down the coast in BC, that perhaps wasn't the approach.
It happens after. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we, LNG aside, there's long history of mining in this province. You can long list of projects that have failed, and almost all of them is because it is unfortunate because the mineral's where the mineral is. So you can't move it. So there's less flexibility for those companies. So there is some sympathy, but if you don't have that relationship, if you've not learned that this is a particularly important area, and then you're really starting from you're starting already penalized.
Yeah, I think so. And also this also has to become a part of your project mandate or overall project premise, is that you have communities and you have First Nations involvement. And and there is a share and a say, as Chief Crystal Smith would say. So that becomes part of your economic value proposition.
Was this Shell Canada's approach, or was this Susannah Pierce's approach? And, we worked for an international overseas company for years. What was the ethos of Shell heading into this project in Canada?
Well, and so I'm glad you asked, because as a joint venture, and we call it a non-operated joint venture, so I, as Shell Canada, don't speak for LNG Canada. I did when I worked for them as a secondee for Shell, but now in my role, I can't. But at the time, the ethos or the approach was an LNG Canada approach, which was the joint venture partners. So all collectively, and the approach was that, I would say this, given a lot of license to do this. The good thing was, and I felt this, like when we looked at the leadership team of LNG Canada, you had your CEO, you had your CFO, you had your chief legal officer, you had your chief project officer, it's called that, and you had your chief stakeholder officer, CSO, if you want to call it. I had a number of different titles but basically it all comprised how we make the project work with community, First Nations, and other stakeholders. And so that was as much a leadership position as your CEO, your CFO, your chief legal. That was really important.
And they recognize that.
And they recognize that. So you were not subject to, or you were not less than, or had to report up into. So those issues were as much a priority as your financial considerations, or they were considered as part of your financial considerations. So you had a seat at the table. And I actually thought, when you look at organizational design, if that person who is not responsible for, or who is responsible for those aspects of your asset, of your product, it's not there, that is a problem. That's an indication to you that those issues are not as important, or they are subjugated to other issues. I think it was really good from the beginning. We had it right at the same level, because then you were at that table, you could opine on, well, I don't think that's a good idea because, and then you'd be having that debate and that discussion, the leadership table. And we had a lot of those, by the way. And, but you having the voice, I think, did make a difference in terms of how we would approach the overall project. And we made some pretty good decisions as a result of it.
And that's a learning, perhaps, for energy companies across Canada, is that that's the model, the HR model that you almost have to have in place to help give you your best chance at project success, right? Is that it's not a junior level director or senior manager position. It is a C-suite level position on that leadership team who is given as much airtime as an engineering head and a head of finance.
If you look at how projects get stopped, stakeholder opposition, ought you not to consider, well, how do you unpack that and make sure that right in the beginning of your project decision making that those issues are right at the table?
But you, I mean, in your world, LNG and Shell aside, you deal with other CEOs and other senior folks in this space. You're encountering, I'm sure, and I don't want you to name names or anything, companies that this is the side of somebody's desk, or I'm running $1 billion capital project, and I'm going to put, I'm sort of wringing my hands about spending $5 million on stakeholder relations, right? You see that all the time.
Okay, yeah, definitely. And again, each project may be different. I mean, your impacts and the proximity to communities may be different. So it depends, again, on the development. But I do think that especially in the world where we live today, where people are more engaged, they have more avenues for engagement. There's more opportunities for litigation. There's more opportunities for, influence, as we know, through any kind of media form, that it really requires that we're very thoughtful about it and engaged and involved. The other thing I would say, too, is that in my role, too, this is a direct line with the community all the way up. So it was not like the community was way down there. No, community issues came to the decision table, came to the leadership table. We were talking about that. And that was kind of the cool thing of the size of the company, too, because we were one company based here looking at all these issues. We're not one company with, sort of global experience, but it does tell you that when we run multinational company, you still need to look community level up and how you're making sure that there's a recycling of those issues all the way through the leadership so that you are not caught flat-footed, you're planning effectively, et cetera.
But, so let's talk about culture the other way. We've talked about, dealing with cultures in terms of your interaction with the stakeholders, the people in the communities, impacted Indigenous communities. That's a cultural challenge. But you are in a multicultural company itself with people who had significant financial interests, who, countries that have different interests perhaps, and different, you never have mind corporate cultures, but different cultures generally.
Definitely.
So you had Chinese investors, you had Korean, you had Malaysian, Dutch, obviously. So how did you manage that? I think that's an interesting thing for people listening to a podcast like this, is say, yeah, okay, now we're starting to learn what we have to do with the culture on the ground. How do you manage these?
See, this is a really great.
This is how Canada works.
This is how Canada works, and and it's a really it's a much deeper conversation when we really think about it, because you're spot on. Each of the companies, national oil companies versus independent oil companies. As a national oil company, you're a company of the state, and so you have your Petronas, you have your China National Petroleum Company, you have your KOGAS, and so those companies are different than your IOCs, which might be a Shell, might be a Mitsubishi. And so though that in itself, when you're a state company versus an independent, that's a difference as well in terms of how you approach things.
And how do you educate them on, listen, I've got to do this with this small Indigenous community?
Again, it's the structure of the joint venture. It was also the structure of the committees that you set up. So in our case, we had the joint venture, basically joint venture partners. And as LNG Canada CEO, we would report up into them and share what was going on in the project, because they were our investors ultimately. And then you had committees under that, which you would basically inform about, community issues, Indigenous issues, environment, permitting. So you had your own committee where you would share what you were doing. Again, your non-operated venture, but you still kept your shareholders, your joint venture participants informed. And I can remember, to give you an example of how do you get them to understand, or how do you get them to be sort of with you in terms of how you are approaching things. You have to spend a lot of time basically saying why doing it a certain way will yield to the outcome again that we're trying to achieve, especially if they don't have experience in the region. And it takes a little bit of time, but ultimately if you have their trust and confidence, and then you can demonstrate that you're moving the needle in the right direction, again, you will continue to move forward. But it does take some work. It does take a lot of communicating, a lot of sitting together and explaining. It does take a lot of review. There's a lot of things that we reviewed in these committees to make sure that everybody felt comfortable. They brought back to their companies and made decisions that way. But I'll share with you something kind of interesting. I remember one of my first engagements with one of the companies, and I was talking about the political stability in Canada. Canada is very stable, from a risk perspective. And they looked at me and they laughed. I said, what are you talking about? You have elections every 4 years. Things are changing all the time. In our country, we don't have elections like this. We have much more stability. I'm like, that's interesting. But, if we do look at some of the regulatory swings we are in, if we do look at a lot of the regulatory complexities that we're in from a subnational to a national government, things like that, there's maybe an element of insight in that.
Well, we always say there's always an election. I mean, if it's not municipal, it's provincial. If it's not provincial, it's a nation. If it's not a nation, it's the federal government. Right. I mean, really every year in some form or another, we're experiencing an election. Besides elections, let's dig a bit at policy, because you did bring it up there. We obviously have a lot of different policies in Canada and in British Columbia in particular. What strategic advice would you give to policymakers after your experience with LNG Canada, dealing with international audience and local domestic audience? What policy changes need to happen so that these projects can more easily be moved through? And what hurdles did you have to overcome at LNG Canada?
Well, you know that, again, for any investor, all of us included, if we put our money in any kind of investment, we want to have the greater certainty that we will make a return on that. And what can impact that investment? Well, regulatory change can, policy change can, taxes as an example. So when we make an investment, we are making an investment in projects like this for 40 years. And so you want to have at least some degree of certainty that you know the direction of travel of where the regulatory policy or the policy is going. The challenge that we're in, particularly as we consider some pretty significant policy in energy transition or climate policy, is that can swing. And we're seeing some of that potential swing, at the federal level. But in our case, we make a number of scenarios and we say that we could live with this project in these scenarios. And then we spend a lot of time working with policymakers to say, well, these are the trade-offs. So if this changes, this could have an impact on this investment. And it's a risk. Political change is a risk. Regulatory change is a risk. But part of it is your degree of certainty that you know the direction of where the policy is going over a period of time. But you also have the ability to continue to engage with stakeholders about how that change, whatever it might be, might impact your project and that investment right up front. But it's not something that you could say, okay, all done. It's a constant thing that you need to do. And I think when I think about Canada right now, and especially when we think about when we're trying to transition, assuming we're trying to transition pretty quickly from the basis of energy we have today, which is largely fossil fuels, 80% in general, when we're trying to transition very quickly to something that is not, the challenge is going to be that in order to make some of these investments economic, you're going to need a lot more policy and regulatory as sort of foundation. And that requires that, again, a decision that I might make might be changed because of that. That's a significant policy. And then you have a change in government, that significant policy goes away. Well, then you've made an investment that doesn't make sense. So we're really in an interesting place right now, especially with energy transition and technologies that are not yet commercial or economic in and of themselves, because it's not a natural progression. We're not naturally, policy is really influencing our decisions. And that, for me, creates more risk, because if you do have a change in government that doesn't like that policy, they pull it out, well, then the economics of your project are in more risk. And I think that's something that we have to really consider when we think about these choices, especially as we accelerate decarbonization.
Yeah, and something we've talked about on the podcast before is the fact that clean energy projects have to go through the same regulatory process as not clean energy projects. And what we find happening is that these projects are also really slow to move forward because of the existing policy.
Is it a climate emergency or not, right? I mean, it's curious that you're working on some big carbon capture projects. Do they want this to occur or not?
Yeah. Well, and so these are the interesting value trade-offs that we make, right? Because if I'm a landowner and I'm upset because I have a wind turbine in my view shed, I can be just as upset at that as if I had a well pad in my view shed. Do I not have the same right to argue about it? I mean, it's my land, it's my view shed. It's still the view shed. It might be two different types of projects. So I guess part of that is we're saying to the landowner, okay, in one case, you have a good reason for us to accelerate. In the other case, you don't. I don't know. That's a value judgment. And that's for something for government. Again, that's the responsibility of government. And I think the population to say, this is what we think might be right. But I think this is a really interesting time for us where we are saying we will accelerate some projects, but not others. That's a government decision. That's a policy decision. But that does have an impact on the individual stakeholder.
Sure. I want to take it back a little bit. I jumped over here. LNG Canada, that was a big chunk of your past decade or so. Without maybe sort of taking you into any dark spaces, what were the low points? As you as an individual, maybe with the project, there must have been some times where you're like, I don't want to do this. I want to throw up my hands.
Yeah. I think when you do a project like this, any kind of big project where you've got a number of different work streams and you're time driven, you're deliverables driven, because all of this is you're giving your shareholders, your investors a commitment. We will get this done by this period of time because they're making sizable capital decisions. So there's a lot of pressure to keep to schedule. So I can remember times where, we were having challenges moving through one aspect of the DFO, like the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, and it was taking longer than expected, and there was lots of challenges and backs and forths. I can remember that being a really difficult time because we had pretty much received most of our other permits, and it was just outstanding with the DFO, and so that was having a knock-on effect on our real project schedule. And actually, the more that we delayed, the more risk there was that capital would go someplace else. So that, for me, at that point, was a difficult period of time. We ended up working through it with DFO and the HISLA together, and working through what would make sense. I also, of course, with Coastal GasLink and some of the challenges up there, those are really difficult times too, and where you see a certain degree of opposition, but then you also see a great degree of support and and how that all got itself worked out. I mean, these are really hard issues because these are really strong, these are people that are engaged and involved, whether you're an advocate or whether you're an opponent. These are people who really believe very strongly. And there's of course, as you know, a lot of tense times.
Well, Coastal GasLink, I hadn't actually, obviously I know it's associated, but I wasn't really tying, there was and still remains, there was violence, it was pretty nasty.
Yeah.
Regardless of one's position on the project itself. How did that affect you and your team?
It's difficult. Yeah, it's really tough. It's really tough. One, because you see people whose lives are being threatened, people who are being stripped of title, individuals who are being basically accused. I mean, there was so much that was going on. Threatened, individuals who are standing up for something and then finding themselves threatened. Really hard. I also found myself threatened at times, but you have faith, you'll get through it. You try to support each other through it. Chief Crystal Smith, Karen Ogan also had a lot of attack personally, and that was really tough. And as people, so these are really grounding moments for each one of us as individuals to find our strength in this very difficult period of time. And I do think in the end, having faith, you get through it. You do get through it, and you do get stronger about it because you know who you are and you know what you stand for because you really are making these choices. But those were tough times to see people that you care about or individuals standing up for something being threatened on both sides, and seeing that degree of violence over this was definitely not easy.
And you wear it personally, right? I mean, when you work for these projects or you're involved in them or linked to them, it affects you personally because you really care. You can see the good that could come, but you're having to stand up for something that's, sometimes demoralizing.
Yeah. And again, you are, as you're advancing a project, in my position, you were looking at all sides and trying to understand the positions. You're trying to really make sure that you are accounting for what the concerns are as well as what the supporters, because you also really want to have an honest conversation about what's happening, to find the best path forward. So you need to actually be open to the criticism, be open to the accusation so that you can actually find out whether or not there's truth there. And if there is, how you might actually work with that. So again, you do learn to really ground yourself that you believe in something when you're challenged by your own beliefs.
Absolutely.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, but we want to know, again, about you. What's next? What's next for Susannah Pierce? The challenges you're looking forward to? What do you want to do next? Personally, professionally?
Professionally.
What do you want to build next?
It's kind of funny. So it's not really kind of funny. I think you sort of reach a point in your life. I think it was Carl Jung who said that the first half of your life is sort of a mistake and the second half is kind of by design, or in other words, so I'm at that second half of my life, in my view, which is much more by design. And you think a lot more about everything that you've learned to this point. How do you apply it in a way for greater good? And, I think each of us are always here for greater good. But I think when you reach a certain point in your life, you go, there's much more that I think I can do for greater good. And when I think about that, I think a lot about where Canada is, where the province is, in terms of hitting at or above our weight in terms of prosperity. And prosperity is a big word, but ultimately what it means is that we are a country which has natural endowments that we can develop in such a way that provides benefits to us as Canadians, but also to the world. And again, that sounds very cliche and very sloganish, but it's very true. And, when I look at energy, when I look at critical minerals, when I look at food, when I look at our population, when I look at our level of productivity, when I look at our competitiveness, we have all of the ingredients to be very successful, yet we're not yet hitting at our weight, let alone above our weight. And we do know that in a growing world that needs resources, we have a lot that we could provide to them while also providing a lot of economic prosperity to Canadians. So part of what I believe the next part of my life is to really try to open up that conversation in a way that's meaningful and actionable so that people can actually understand that we can advance the interests of Canadians here at home, raise our level of prosperity, deal with some of the social challenges that we are faced with, and then also really help parts of the world that desperately need it too. And the world is changing very quickly, and we know what's happening in the world, and we see it every day. But geopolitically, there's lots of things that are shifting, and that also keeps me very aware that Canada also has a role to play on the world stage. And there's an opportunity for us to step up into that, but we have to get our own house in order first.
Yeah, we have to remove some barriers at home. right, that are existing today in our political environment, in our policy environment, I think, to help ensure that we're supporting Canadians in a way that in the resource industry, I think we see it. We see the possibility, right? I think there's no one that I've ever worked with in the resource industry that isn't an optimist about this.
Well, you're a parent. I think he's like, you want your children to live up to their potential. It's like our country is, I guess, we want our country to live up to its potential.
Yeah.
And it's hard when it doesn't.
Well, I get, and I guess somebody, it was funny, my son said to me the other day, I think I was walking with him and we were by this sort of park that had been overgrown with things and, just hadn't been kept up. But you could see the natural beauty of the park. And it has these old ruins, and I'm like, wish I had a little bit of money and I could actually just clean it up and just sort of do this and do that. It's like, Mom, won't you ever be satisfied with what you've got? I'm like, honey, I am more than satisfied with what I've got, but I always see the potential for something greater here. Like, it's not about what I've got. I just see the potential in so many different things. And so that's how I look at the potential for Canada. We, compared to many other places in the world, have it pretty darn good. Let's not kid ourselves about that, honestly. But it's the potential that we have to do even more for ourselves, for each other, and also for other people in the world that I think is our greater potential, that I think is within reach. It will take work and time, but I do think we have an opportunity, and that's what I really want to try and help, whether it's through my role in this company, whether it's through my role as a person in this province, in this country, lending a voice to that. But then it's also, again, lending a voice to people that have been either not at the table, disenfranchised, who are vulnerable, who have been, unfortunately, in our society, forgotten. There's a lot of work that I think we have to do there, and I don't think we have to spend much time looking around some streets here to see that those are people that have been left behind. And that's not good as Canada. That's not something we should be proud of either. So there's a lot of things that we can do by having prosperity to deal with some of these social challenges, and that's a really important part of where I hope I could spend some time.
Words of wisdom. So within reach, but work in time.
Absolutely.
And they're so linked, right?
Yeah, they absolutely
The prosperity side and the social side, they're so intertwined.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Susannah, for coming in today. We really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for listening to today's podcast, Primary Risk episode number 3. Please follow us to receive notifications of upcoming episodes wherever you may get your podcast. Check out the show and show notes for reference to any materials that were mentioned during today's discussion with Susannah. And new episodes of Primary Risk are released monthly. Please follow us. We're excited to announce our new upcoming podcast guests very shortly. So follow us on LinkedIn. And cheers.
Cheers.
Thank you so much. Cheers.
Thanks lots.
Cheers.